Hi, my name is Jordan Korfman, and this is my critical assignment on Hurricane Ida. The disaster that I chose to evaluate is Hurricane Ida. Hurricane Ida was a Category 4 hurricane that swept through southern Louisiana along with the Caribbean in late August of 2021. This hurricane caused catastrophic damage, including severe power outages along with severe flooding. Following the events of Hurricane Katrina in 2005, many response efforts were present and worked quickly to help those affected in this hurricane. However, there were still some instances where the emergency response could have been better to prevent such extensive damage from being done prior to the event. Some background on Hurricane Ida is that its emergency period took place from August 26 to September 2nd of 2021. Hurricane Ida began in the eastern Caribbean Sea and then progressed and moved across the western Caribbean. Hurricane Ida was labeled as a tropical depression on August 26th of 2021 and then was later classified as a tropical storm just a few hours later. On August 27th, it was labeled as a hurricane, and over the next 2 days, Hurricane Ida escalated from a Category 2 to a Category 4 hurricane. Continuing on with some of the severe characteristics of Hurricane Ida, this hurricane had winds up to 150 miles per hour. Hurricane Ida greatly hit southeastern Louisiana during this time. This hurricane also created extensive power outages along with intense flooding due to improper drainage systems within Louisiana. Hurricane Ida left over a dozen people dead and also left thousands of people in need of relocation and evacuation due to their homes being destroyed or other such factors. Hurricane Ida created over $75 billion worth of damage in southern Louisiana alone. There was a pretty proficient and quick emergency response following the events of Hurricane Ida. Some of these emergency responses were that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers worked closely with FEMA to respond to this disaster. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA worked together to help reestablish power in the affected areas. They also provided temporary housing for those who were in need of relocation or had devastations done to their homes. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA also installed pumps to help ensure excess water was able to be removed and drained properly. They also funded over $330 million for supply aid to give support to those whose lives were uprooted by Hurricane Ida in southern Louisiana. Continuing on with the emergency response efforts that followed Hurricane Ida, in the 6 months following this hurricane, FEMA opened up 40 disaster recovery centers, and these centers assisted over 76,000 citizens of Louisiana that were affected by this hurricane. The National Flood Insurance Program worked with 22,000 survivors and worked side by side with them to help them rebuild their homes and also rebuilding them to be safer and stronger in case of an emergency like this happening again. FEMA's Public Assistance Program helped remove around 22.5 million cubic yards of debris from the affected areas, helping just clean up the affected areas and giving these people their lives back in a way. Although there were a lot of very successful and helpful emergency measures taking place following the events of Hurricane Ida, there were also some factors that helped lead to such extensive damage occurring where some of the emergency responses could have been better. Many people involved in emergency management were not prepared for how quickly Ida was going to progress, which made critical decisions and evacuation efforts very critical and very stressful for them. Many power backup generators were not established prior to this hurricane, and if they were, it would have helped prevent the 1 million people losing power in Louisiana alone. Along with this, sufficient drainage systems were not pre-established in these areas, which caused the flooding to be significantly worse. If the emergency management had prepared better, or built these cities better for an event such as this would not have occurred. For an integration of faith, I personally think that in situations such as natural disasters, it is important to remember that God has a plan, and everything that happens, God ultimately knows everything that is going to happen and is aware of the outcome. And sometimes his plans are far beyond human thinking, and we should not question his plans. It is important for individuals to trust in him during these times, such as the disaster of Hurricane Ida, when people had their homes and their families taken from them. It's definitely a very, very difficult time for people to remember this, but I think that a verse that helps reiterate this is Jeremiah 29:11, which says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." I think this verse is important to just remind ourselves in times of need that God does have a plan, and that it may not seem like there is a purpose now, but in the future there is something good that might come from it. When examining Hurricane Ida and the emergency response that followed, I wanted to put together a list of the positives and negatives that came from emergency management during this time. The biggest cons that I found were that there were insufficient drainage systems within the affected areas. People in emergency management were also underprepared for how quickly Hurricane Ida would progress. And there was also a lack of backup power generators within the areas affected. The biggest pros that I found was that emergency management helped provide housing to those affected. They also made efforts to rebuild the affected areas, and then they also implemented the proper generators and drainage systems following this event. I think that this goes to show that if those in emergency management were better prepared prior to the incident, a lot less damage would have been done. Most of their actions were taken following the effects of the hurricane, and though they did do a lot to help the people involved along with the areas involved, if they would have been more prepared prior to it, a lot less damage would have been done and a lot less suffering would have occurred. In conclusion, after following the events of Hurricane Ida along with the emergency response to it, I think that overall the emergency response efforts were fairly well done and did help support millions of people in their time of need. I think that a lot of this can be accredited to Hurricane Katrina, which occurred in 2005, and the failures that came in emergency responses during that disaster. However, I think that there were still a lot of preparations that could have been done prior to a disaster such as Hurricane Ida, which would have helped ensure as little damage as possible would be done. For example, the drainage systems along with the backup generators and such things. I think that by preparing for disasters, it not only helps the cities and individuals involved, but this would also help emergency management to stress less when responding to these disasters. I think that if these preparations took place, the people involved in emergency management would not have to be under such stress or have to make so many critical decisions regarding an incident following the damage already being done. This is a list of the references I used to examine Hurricane Ida and the emergency measures that followed. That is the end of my critical assignment following the effects of Hurricane Ida. Thank you so much for listening.